Hello and welcome to this podcast from Geopolitical Futures. I'm Christian Smith. The US decision to recuse itself from European security has created something of a crisis on the continent. America wants European countries to pick up their own defense spending and focus on their own region. So what's the feeling from Europe on the future of any potential military alliance? And how practical would it be? Well, today on the pod, we are joined by Geopolitical Futures chairman and founder, George Friedman, and Antonia Colibasanu, Geopolitical Futures senior analyst, and the author of the book, Geopolitics, Geoeconomics, and Borderlands, a study of a changing Eurasia and its implications for Europe. George, you are coming to us from the Romanian capital, Bucharest. Antonia, you're, of course, based there yourself. George, you are, I suppose, on something of a tour of Southeastern and Eastern Europe. You're meeting politicians and diplomats. You're shaking hands, kissing babies, that sort of thing. What struck you so far about your visit to Romania?
There are no babies to kiss. That's what it is. So what struck me as really interesting is the degree to which there is fear of Russia and a sense of Russian power are really being present. They see it in the way the Russians shape public opinion and believe they're controlling elections and so on. They're, of course, extremely concerned about the Black Sea and control and about Crimea, all these things. But unlike myself, they seem to have a very different view of Russia than I do. As my readers know, I regard the Ukrainian war as a disaster for the Russians, proving that they are incapable of a rapid deployment even in a country like Ukraine. Yet at the same time, here in Romania, there's a sense that the Russians are pressing in on them in various ways. They talk about their actions in the Black Sea. They talk about all sorts of things. So there's a disconnect between at least my perception of the Russians as relatively weak and not particularly competent militarily. They see them as a very strong force. And it's something I don't fully understand why they do. But perhaps Antonia, who lives here, is born here, can explain it a little better.
Well, I will take it from there because it's a challenge that George has asked me to take on, and I will. Well, geographically, when we are looking to the United States, we are always discussing in our meetings that the United States is worried that someone would get close to its coast on the Atlantic or the Pacific, right? So in Romania, we are about 200 miles away from Crimea, which is Russia de facto, and we are less than 80 miles from Russia de facto territory on the Black Sea, which is an internal sea and has no international waters. We have seen Russia in this sea being aggressive well before 2024 and well before 2014. It has intensified its hybrid actions that have to do with jamming commercial ships and dealing with all sorts of blocking, for instance, territory out of the Black Sea, so no economic activity could be developed in those territories because they were pretty much saying that they want that territory to exercise for military reasons, which is doable under international law. So right now it is pretty much striking to anyone coming to the region and coming to Romania. Why would Russia be perceived as an enemy while they don't necessarily have a force in the Black Sea and they don't have a military force at all? Well, for us, bordering Russia basically means that, even if Russia is weak, it will find a way to get aggressive. Information warfare is one way to do it, which is relatively cheap, considering the internet can be used by anyone at any point. But I will not get into that because there are experts that are talking better than me, and I don't want to get into that. I'm going to stick to geopolitics, and I'm going to basically discuss territory. So what happens is that the main fear currently with regards to Russia is that it can take Romania or any other country politically by exercising influence. And that is something that we are covering in geopolitics, political influence. And that is something that usually grows into the tactical warfare when there is less military power to use for a country. And we have seen this in history. We have seen this in recent history, including by, information warfare, but not only. And of course, the second dimension is that of the economy. So what happens is that Romania is developing an energy project that has been pushed away for years by Russian political influence in Romania through various ways and means. Of course, this is not, there is one side for Russian blame, but there is also another side for Romanians' weakness. And there is also an explanation for that. But currently, the project is under development, and Romania hopes to put that online until 2027. That basically means that Romania is going to become a competitor to Russia in Southeastern Europe. What countries are going to be served by Romanian gas from the Black Sea? Well, that's pretty easy. Moldova, Hungary, Bulgaria, and others that might need, including Ukraine. That basically puts Romania de facto into a position of competition, of direct competition with Russia, and I suspect that Moscow is not necessarily happy about that. Of course, Moscow is weak. It has no particular means to come and cut off Romanians' wish to put on this energy project together. But at the same time, there is one element of fear. This is the fact that the area where the project is delivered, is put into development, is covered by Russian air-controlled, de facto, not de jure, which means that under international law, no one recognizes Russia as an actor in that perimeter, which is very close to Russia's economic zone, which is why, de facto, they control the air control. De jure, we do not recognize it, and therefore we can attack Russia as an outside power to the perimeter. We, meaning the US, because the US has a military base in Constanța, and it ensures, together with the Romanian, the Coast Guard capabilities for the Black Sea. We, the Turks, the Romanians, and the Bulgarians, because on the naval capabilities, we are coming together in the Black Sea by forming a group right now in demining the Black Sea. So there are ways to push back against a Russia that does not recognize the jure as the one having control over the border and the one having control over the Air Force. But if within an agreement, considering that we are talking about peace agreement or a sort of a truce in Ukraine, if Crimea comes into question and it is recognized as de facto in the jure territory of Russia, then Russia has the right to exercise control over that perimeter where Romania is putting on and developing the energy project. Therefore, we have a case where we would not know what to do if the US recognizes Crimea as a de facto and the jure territory of Russia. Even if the EU or the European states or the UK or other countries like, Asian countries do not recognize that territory, we would be in a position where when Russia tries to jam, for instance, or tries to use the capabilities that air controlling gives Russia, we would be in a position where we would also have to think whether we're coming against the US wish to give Russia the EUR, which is the legal right to come into the perimeter and fight Romania. So this is the biggest fear that we are currently having, and this is why the anxiety that reads all over the place, not to mention the political influences that come along with the question marks regarding to Russia's influence into politics in Romania and Poland, for instance.
And it's we should just clarify quickly, by de jure you mean that under international law, Crimea would be recognized as Russian. I mean, I think it's particularly interesting that, I mean, it's not surprising that Russia would be particularly concerned about this project with Romania, in part because I think it came out this week that Europe as a continent has spent more on Russian gas and oil since the start of the war in Ukraine than it has on actually giving military aid or aid at all to Ukraine. So it tells you how important that gas and oil is for both Russia and for Europe. Antonia, speaking of the Black Sea more generally as well, the EU this week announced a new strategy for the region. Obviously, that's kind of suggesting that the EU is understanding the significance of this. What do you think it means for the region that the EU is taking this interest?
Well, it could mean that actually Europe, in the words of George Friedman, is coming together in a sense. Well, first of all, we do not have a Europe of 44 states, because then we would have a Europe that is stretching towards the Pacific, and the US would border Europe through Russia, because the UN actually considers Russia as part of Europe. But we have a Europe of a limited number of states, which are coming together now for practical reasons with regards to, first of all, socioeconomic fears that are coming from areas like energy security, because obviously the Black Sea is important for supply of energy, considering the project that we have recently discussed. But it is also important to understand that Europe, as it is right now, as a European Union, needs to act together on security. And security also involves military power. So as we all know, Rearm Europe and other projects that have to deal with industrializing Europe to come together and put a military force that is actually European and is produced in Europe, so the weaponry is also produced in Europe, has to have a strategic platform, and that strategic platform refers to the Russian threat in Ukraine and in the Baltic Sea. So in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea. So basically, Europe is saying, well, we need to have the foundational understanding to build up our military, to build up our economic resilience, and to tell our people on the political platforms of the three areas of geopolitics why we are actually coming together to defend ourselves against Russia, but not only against Russia. If you are looking into the statement, there will be a hint towards China as well, which is coming closer through the Black Sea as well, considering its involvement in Georgia and considering its interest to develop port infrastructure. The EU is also putting together some ideas in that strategy document referring to developing infrastructure, and that is actually coming after funding has been given to developing infrastructure, which is a first if you think about the traditional slow mode that has been the feature of the European Union. So it's probably the first time that we are seeing money put into something, an infrastructure project being developed, before a strategy document is being put together with no cocktail attached. So it's pretty telling that there is some urgency that is being considered by the states that are coming together and are saying, well, this region is important. European Union is important to us because economically, Russia cannot really provide the security. And the US, well, with tariffs and everything, kind of signals that it has some other business to do, which means that we need to take ourselves seriously. So it's one point where the Europeans seem to take themselves seriously. The Europeans as European Union, not the Europeans as the UN Europe, though, because that would actually be peace on earth. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for anybody that follows the EU, you're quite right that rapid movement without all of those attachments for this Black Sea policy is quite something. George, let's bring you back in here. I mean, we're talking here about from the Baltic to the Black Sea, or even the Baltic to the Adriatic, I suppose. There's an increasingly desire, in part driven by US policy changes, to form a military alliance of some form, or perhaps to maintain the NATO alliance and solidify that more without the US. Do you think that that's possible in Europe?
Well, it's essential. I don't know if it's possible. But it goes like this. First, the United States has not stepped away from NATO. We've pulled no troops out of Europe. We've simply made it clear to Europe that you are not the desolate place you were in 1945 after the war. You're a prosperous nation with technical capabilities and all such things. You have a fundamental problem as Europe, which is that you're a series of different countries speaking different languages, having recent memories of war between each other, Germany and France and so on. And you're going to have to overcome this. So this is a challenge the US is placing to Europe. They're stating the obvious. Your security is more important to you than it is to us. But it's important to us as well, and we'll participate. But the idea that we will be the primary source of security is not present, particularly at a time, and this is where we get back to my original point, the Russians have shown themselves not to be a capable military force. So this was a country that crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, crushed Czechoslovakia when it had to, was a major force that could move actively. In Ukraine, it was a major force that entered the country, but bogged down. It continues to wage a war, but is ingrained on it. So from what I see, the threat of Russia has declined. So would they challenge aerial rights in an area, in a certain space? What consequence would happen to the Russians? So you take a look at Russia. It's a country that in a way is a third world power. Its well-being depends on exporting various minerals, oil, and so on. Okay? Internally, it is not massively developed. And it is really, I won't say impoverished itself through this war, but certainly not done very much for it. And it is a country that is looking for an anchor to itself. The old model that I feel is present here is that this is a great power with tremendous military force, and that it's capable of many aggressive actions, successful this time. And that what they're using is means of subverting elections by introducing propaganda in various ways, which I'll admit the United States has once or twice tried to do as necessary. But that's really not a major threat. This, of course, seems to be a division in Romania between those who are, I'll call it nostalgic in a way, for the days when they were a satellite of Russia, and kind of wanting a relationship with Russia back, and those that want a relationship with Europe. The problem here is, what is Europe? It is a continent. There are two formal organizations, NATO, devoted to defense, the European Union, essentially an economic grouping. Now, a nation state can't exist unless it has both a security dimension and an economic dimension, and they coincide. The institutional structure of Europe is NATO still exists. It has not gone away. And the Germans have moved in a decisive way in Lithuania. And whether it was a German decision, NATO decision, really doesn't matter. And the point is that you can put a brigade in Lithuania and dissuade the Russians from coming. So when I was young, there was a movie called The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. Well, they're not coming very fast. And so when I see these issues like under international law, if we acknowledge the reality, which is that Russia has captured Crimea and is not about to give it back, and agree that the Europeans are not going to counterattack, and we're certainly going to counterattack, signing a piece of paper acknowledging reality doesn't seem to change geopolitical dimension unless you're really beholden to international law. But since international law is a sometime thing, not that it's not an issue, but it's not a pivotal issue of whether or not this is signed. So many countries violate international law, international borders. The Russians are good at that. That we're suddenly going to be respecting that or being forced to respect that because of international law is, to me, a possible but questionable outcome. But all of these things, which to me, as an American, strikes me as, by the way, somewhere on the outskirts, is in Romania in a more urgent way. That if we agreed that Crimea was going to be Russian territory, which it is de facto, if not de jure, this would have a significant shift to the balance of power in the region. When I come here as someone who's born in Hungary and lived through many European experiences, there's a strange hangover from the Cold War that they have not grasped what Russia is at this point, which is a severely weakened country, perhaps divided as well, and has failed in its one aggressive attempt to achieve its goals. And the sense of this towering eminence somewhere very close is really haunting the Romanians. Now, that's my perception as an American who was in Eastern Europe at various times during the Cold War, when that was a very reasonable way to look at the Russians. From my point of view, at this point, it is exaggerating their capabilities. But what I find remarkable, and I may be wrong if this my evaluation based on this, is that the Romanians are looking at Russia as a major factor in their existential condition. Whereas I see it as a country that has very limited military power, certainly has an energy power they have, but certainly if it illegally blocked Romanian airspace, well, Romania is a member of NATO, and NATO has an air force, the American, the British, and so on and so forth, and that would be challenged. And the idea that they are helpless in the face of Russian power strikes me as odd, which means that I'm either very wrong about this, I have to really rethink the balance of power, or I'm certainly missing something in Romania. So I think this is an important issue, because for an American looking at the geopolitical reality, I don't see any threat that Russia could practically pose. And if they were to intrude into airspace in various ways, claiming that this could not be done, well, there are ways to counter this. And certainly Romania as a NATO power would be we'd be beholden to do something about it. They seem not to have that confidence in NATO. Here, you get the feeling that the US has already abandoned NATO, not simply asked the Europeans to catch up with the arming, but we are still very much members of NATO and no force has been removed. So it seems to me, because the people I'm talking to are extremely intelligent and very wise in the world, that the fact that we are seeing it so differently, the reality, is something that's a phenomenon that has to be understood, that we both can't be right in this particular case. There's no middle ground on the way we're evaluating Russia. And that experience was startling to me because I haven't been back to this region for a while. And in fact, 10 years ago, there was less of a fear of Russia, but it's mounted now. And Antonia certainly can explain and has explained to a great extent why this is so. But it turns into a geopolitical reality when a NATO partner, which we are legally and strategically committed to protecting its interests, okay, and certainly have the capability of doing so with or without a buildup of European force, should feel so exposed. And that's really interesting. It's either a hangover from the Cold War that somehow the reality of Russian power has declined, they still can't believe it, or there's a new reality. And that new reality seems to be that there's some influence on the part of Russia in elections where parties rise up that want to have closer relationships to Russia. Now, this is consistent with American policy, which is end the war in Ukraine, stop starting wars, and we'll have a closer relationship with you as well, an economic relationship. And Russia is a country that's desperate for investment, desperate for entering international trade, and so on and so forth. And Romania has done much better at this than the Russians have. So I see a different dynamic, and sometimes when you're far away and you get there, you're startled, and sometimes you should be startled because there's something else going on. So where I don't get is the threats that the Russians pose that can't be countered by a NATO member calling on NATO member countries to act in some way. And perhaps they don't have faith in NATO or anything like that, and that's perfectly reasonable. But I just thought it would be the most interesting thing that I've learned from this trip, which surprised me, which is the mood 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was not nearly a sense of vulnerability to Russian power as it is now. And I see Russian power as having declined dramatically because of the Ukrainian war and its outcome. So I'm sort of at a loss to understand what's happening. And I'll be going to former Yugoslavia, Serbia, Hungary, and these places. And I'll be very interested in what they see the same thing. I think they might. And this really affects both NATO strategy and American strategy. And I'm not sure the Americans truly understand the vulnerability that's felt here. And I'll turn it over to Antonia to rip me apart.
Well, Antonia, what do you think?
Well, it's important to have these discussions, and that is why I believe in geopolitics. We also need to travel to places, and I admit that in order to get a better view of what's going on in Germany, for instance, or what is going on in other countries on the continent, I have to go there and check, not only to give speeches at conferences and discuss at cocktail parties and that sort of thing, which is, necessary and nice. But at the same time, it is important to see the other's perspective. And I think this was very important also to me to see how far apart the visions are and the perceptions are from the American side and the Romanian side. Not that I don't get the American side every day on geopolitical futures calls, and not only the American side, because we are an international company and an international team. But I will certainly be very curious about George's input from Hungary. We do have a Hungarian analyst on our call every day, so we do have some perspective, but she's dealing with Asia. So I will be very much interesting to hear from George after he travels to Hungary.
Well, George, you're off to Hungary in a few days. You were born there. You've got good ties there. So it will be very interesting to hear what you say, what you learn from there. But what do you expect to hear from there at the moment?
Well, remember that Hungary was savaged by the Russians in 1956. There was an uprising, and it was brutally pulled down. So the Hungarians have no like for the Russians. They were the rebellious one. But I think what happened was that in the evolution of things, Viktor Orban, who is the prime minister, basically took a look at the map and said, look, Russia is no longer what it once was. It wasn't the force that came in and crushed me. I can have a relationship with Russia. At the same time, I can be a member of NATO. At the same time, I can be close to the Americans. And he's particularly close to Trump, and he's particularly close to Putin. And this is interpreted as somehow a sort of obscenity, this relationship. But he was the first one that I knew in a serious position who started reevaluating Russia. And that was taken at that time, since it was still in the post-Cold War world, but still with Russia as a major threat of some sort. And his view was that Russia simply is not what it was, and that Russia and the United States are not incompatible. And it was very interesting that many of the countries in NATO who were extremely worried about the American hostility to Russia, who wanted more of accommodation with Russia, less of a Cold War, suddenly turned on someone who actually did that and had a closer relationship with Russia. And it was seen like betrayal. I'm not trying to defend him. There were many flaws in him in many ways, but it was not an unreasonable position to take at the time he took it. And this is what I'm talking about. He rapidly understood, in spite of the Hungarian memory of what Russia meant, he understood that there was a new set of relationships emerging. Much of the rest of the Europeans have also accepted there's a different dynamic going on, yet they want the Cold War to be frozen. In the sense that, for example, the French and the Germans, they want NATO to continue as NATO continued at the time the Russians were a threat. Well, at this point, if they can't take Ukraine, they're not going to take Europe. So that's not a question. So on one side, on the side that was Western, we told, there is a kind of rigidity built in to how we think and treat with the Russians, not as a failed nation that is trying to reconstruct itself, but as an imperial power. This is heavily built on the Ukrainian adventure that they had and did very well in. When I come to Eastern Europe, there's this feeling. Eastern Europe was deeply oppressed by the Russian presence as being satellites, Hungary being one of them, Romania being another. And although the ability to impose force, as they did in 1956 in Hungary, or later in Czechoslovakia, just isn't there at this point. But just as Europe as a whole is still fixated on the institutions that were created out of the Cold War, like NATO and European Union, not evolving them into something more appropriate. The Eastern Bloc, I haven't been to the Eastern Bloc yet, I've been to Romania, still has that same dread of Russia. And when we talk about what I expect to see in Hungary, and I've had the pleasure of meeting Orban and talking to him extensively, he seems to have grasped something that Russia just doesn't have that power. They would say, but he invaded Ukraine, Putin. But he failed in Ukraine. After 3 years, he holds less than 20% of the country, where the Red Army could have taken it, or I would assume in a couple of months. He couldn't do it. So there's a difference between the perception of Russia and the reality of Russia. The perception of Russia remains the Cold War perception, whereas it's demonstrated that where it took Hungary in 2 days, it didn't take Ukraine very much. So I wonder whether there is a cultural element here on both the Western and the Eastern side of a Russia that's very different today and is capable of very much less. And that's a way of me engaging in psychology, which is where I always go when I don't have any idea what I'm talking about. But, that's what I'm trying to drag out somehow. And I'll be very interested in going to Belgrade, where the Russians are now accusing them of sending ammunition to Ukraine, and which I thought was fairly close to the Russians, and then going to Hungary. So I think confusion reigns, as it did after World War II. Is the war really over? Is the Cold War really over? And I think that's part of it, but I'm not sure. And Antonia, who's living through it and shares many of the fears and can explain many of the fears, she can explain why they feel this way. And I can't grasp what difference it makes if you have a piece of paper that you've signed saying, yeah, you conquered this place, we're not going to take it back from you. And as a result of that, they're going to control airspace. That to me makes very little sense. It makes total sense as a possibility to the Romanians and to Antonia. And that's a very interesting psychological event. Now, many Americans would share her views about Russia, who still, fear and everything else. But the Americans, certainly Trump, has shifted to a different position, which is, I don't know why you're still fighting this war. You lost it. Why don't I have peace? And something may come out of that to return. So that's where I stand, which is that I'm trying to grasp this. And I'm also going to be eager to go to Hungary. But I already heard this in Hungary 4 or 5 years ago.
A piece of paper, Antonia, is that how the Romanians see it?
Well, certainly not. As an adopted American by Geopolitical Futures and Stratfor a while back, I fully understand how you can be detached when you have two oceans to reach out to anyone else. And I'm not going to remind that it is only less than, I think, 70 miles until we reach Russia from Constanța, Romania, which is an important place also for the American military, I might add. But a piece of paper basically is translated these days for us as if Russia attacks and the U.S. actually signs that piece of paper and recognizes the Russian right to attack, will we be also attacking back in our defense against Russia, the U.S.? Because we can certainly, and we do not want to do that, the U.S. being our most important partner. So that perception of George, that we no longer seem to be as trustful in NATO. It is not NATO that we do not trust, I think. it is a question mark on what the US is really doing today, and the fear that the US might actually sign that paper knowing that we will not be able to defend ourselves once that is done.
Well,
I know it sounds very science fiction for an American, and it is very difficult to understand because you really did not have a country coming close less than 100 miles to your shores.
yes, but we had a country coming close as we fought World War II, and we did spend 80 years on the front lines at division of Germany, watching the Russians and waiting for them. So we were as paranoid about the Russians as anyone was. And in fact, we probably overestimated them back then too. But having served at that time, I will say that the Europeans accepted the American presence as not a temporary thing, but as a permanent situation. And they failed to evolve, even though they evolved economically, taking place. So the issue is not, in this case, what the United States will do, which has been the question all the time in Europe. It's what Europe will do. So, firstly, it is not an American issue, and this is what we're trying to say. You guys are perfectly capable of sanctioning Russia in 42 different ways and causing them problems. And secondly, international law is a lovely thing, and sometimes it's followed. But the idea that in the event we sign a paper, the Russians are not going to have to give guarantees that they're not going to not engage in actions hostile to Romania. Now, that promise is worth as much as our signing that paper, nothing, which is the mere fact that we signed a paper saying, you've conquered the country, we're not going to invade you, Crimea is yours. Okay. And therefore, it means anything you want to do out of Crimea is okay with us. But the most important question is, the United States is hardly unsophisticated about Europe. There are many of us who served there, and many of us who came from there. And the United States is quite understanding. What I don't understand, and I'm not challenging you because you're smarter than I am and everything, I give you that credit. I'm challenging you to not recognize the decline of Russia as a power. The Americans have maintained their power in Europe in spite of the fact that Russia is so confused in Ukraine. Maybe it'll recover and maybe it'll become something else. But fearing that the United States, under its current circumstance, would simply stand by while the Russians used this concession. What concession? You are in Crimea and we're not going to drive you out, to isolate NATO country members goes counter to everything the United States does. But it does say at this point that your European allies should be carrying that load. But until they do, our forces remain there. So I don't fully understand the sense of vulnerability that the Romanians have. Because I do think that if we sign that piece of paper, and the Russians then decided to close airspace, there'd be F-35s coming through that airspace real fast. We would challenge that very quickly. But I would hope they'd be German aircraft and Polish aircraft and Romanian aircraft. In other words, I see no strength in Russia that can't be challenged by you there. But then I wouldn't be there at the time it's challenged. I'd be in Texas rooting for the good guys, and you'd be right there, Antonia.
Well, look, George, you're obviously off to Hungary in a couple of days. Subscribers to Geopolitical Futures can find out about George's experiences there. And if you're not a subscriber, you could, of course, go to geopoliticalfutures.com. And if you'd like to read about George's recent piece on the significance of German troops being placed in Lithuania, you can do that now as well. But final question, George, and to change the subject just a little bit, but speaking of perceptions of security, I suppose, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has made news this weekend, over the weekend, saying that an invasion of Taiwan by China is potentially imminent. I'll just read out the quote. "The threat China poses is real and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be." Now, just wade yourself through that forest of conditionality there, George. What do you make of that? Do you think that there could be an imminent threat to Taiwan from China?
I'm afraid that our Secretary of Defense doesn't understand the word imminent. Probably and imminent don't go together. Imminent means they're about to invade. There is an element here that we have to discuss, however, which is that the United States and China are mutually locked together economically. We're hostile to each other militarily. That is not a sustainable position. In other words, if China continues to threaten to take Taiwan, which it does not need to do, it's not critical to its national security, maybe to its honor, how do we stay dependent on Chinese imports in that situation? So one of the things is that in the media and everywhere else, the security situation and the economic situation seem not to be close together. So if our Secretary of Defense would have said something like, we are now in negotiations with China on the questions of tariffs, which is important to both of our countries and how we decided, this would be a very good time for the Chinese not to be talking about invading Taiwan. This would have been a very thoughtful piece. But instead, in a closing argument, he used the word imminent. And in some European papers, I understand, this was taken to be a belief that the Chinese are about to attack. Well, a Chinese attack on Taiwan is extremely difficult because their supply lines runs through the water. And today, missiles can easily take out the transport craft. It's not as easy to carry out amphibious warfare any longer. And I doubt the Chinese will try it. But I would like him to look up in the encyclopedia that probably imminent is not an option.
Well, George, thank you as always for your time. Antonia as well. I hope you both enjoy the rest of your time there. And thank you out there for listening to this episode from Geopolitical Futures. We will be back again soon with another podcast. But until then, you take care and goodbye.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.